Good morning. I'd like to call the Beach Inlet Sound Advisory Committee's meeting to order for August. We welcome everybody. We've got most all of our people here that's supposed to be here, which is a good thing. I mean, some of us hadn't seen each other in a while, so we're glad to have everybody back. You will notice that Chris Gibson is with us by WebEx. I hope he's doing something fun, but he's not going to be in a minute because he's going to have to make a lot. And I don't think he has. I think he's been putting together a lot of stuff that we're going to talk about. But we're happy to have him with us by WebEx. And so if anybody's got any special comments or anything they want to make, all right. Well, I'd like to have approval of the agenda for today. Can I get a motion to approve the agenda?
Make a motion to approve the agenda.
Motion approved. A second?
Second.
Any discussion? All in favor say aye.
Aye.
All opposed? Like sign. Next, I want to talk about the approval of the June 20th, which is 2 months ago, the June 20th minutes. I'd like to get those approved. We did make a few changes back and forth and forth, but in any event, in essence, it has remained the same. So I'd like to have a motion to approve those minutes if I could.
So moved.
So moved. Second? Second. Any discussion? All in favor say aye. Aye. All opposed? Okay, thank you. We've now come to the public comments portion of our meeting. If there's anybody that's got has anybody registered to make comments, or would anyone like to make any comments this morning? Amazing. How are we going to know what we're going to talk about if y'all don't come up with some comment? Okay, thank you all for being here.
All right, it's really hot. There was a comment.
Yeah,
I got up this morning and it said it was 82 degrees, but it felt like 95. It's
but
hot.
you know, it really felt better this morning than it has a lot of mornings, because when I went out, when I went out by the water with my dog early this morning, there was actually a little breeze. It felt like a breeze. It didn't feel like an oven that was blowing. So it didn't last long, but it was there this morning. Okay, at this point then, we're going to get to Manager Darian to talk to us about the current status of the shoreline protection projects, if any.
Yes, thank you. Good morning, everyone. The first item to report on is the Army Corps of Engineer letter of acknowledgement. I have submitted a letter of acknowledgement to them regarding their intent to construct the Surf City portion of the Coastal Storm Risk Management Project, which is for, as we know, for the town of Surf City. Based on discussions with the district and the town of Surf City, there will be a transition between the two towns that extends approximately 1,000 feet into the southern town limit of North Topsail Beach. That is where it'll be tapered, and the sand will taper with placement into this transition area. The town of Surf City will be securing necessary easements for the property owners that are affected in this area. The intent of the letter was to first and foremost acknowledge the project, and second, to say we will assist in communications with residents at the appropriate time regarding the portion of the project that occurs along the shoreline of North Topsail Beach. So once I get more information from Surf City, I will be communicating to that through our social media and website for the public to be aware, and the residents.
Before you leave that, can I just ask you a couple of quick questions? One is, so basically, and this is not being a jerk, we're going to get 1,000 feet of free sand from the project.
Yes.
That's
And
nice.
spreading benefits from the project.
Right, and I was going to say, and as I remember, when we were looking at this before, that the sand tends to move south to north. So anything that's built is going to move into our phase 5 and phase 4.
Yeah. The longshore current's gonna take it towards Serenity Point and Topsail Beach.
So,
Well,
And it's gonna be a taper, so it's not gonna be like we're gonna have a
cliff.
100-foot wide beach.
Right.
It's gonna start at whatever 100-foot wide, whatever the Corps builds in Surf City, and it's gonna taper down to
Okay. And I still
probably
haven't seen
10 or 20 feet
well,
wide
in
at the end.
conversations with ATM yesterday with Fran Way, he did say that we would receive some spreading benefits. So to what extent, I don't know. We won't know that till later on, but we will receive some spreading benefits according to the engineer. Did you, anything else? Okay. Annual monitoring, that was completed in June. ATM was working on a beach-wide volume comparison with last year's survey. This information is going to be discussed in greater detail at the September Board of Aldermen meeting, where he will be giving a more of a formal report on those numbers. The nourishment benefits in Phase 1 and Phase 5 are evident, and there also appears to be some nourishment spreading benefits into Phase 4, from what we can tell. The beach and Marina Way area, which is Phase 2, lost material in addition to Beach Access 4, which is the county beach access, where we just did the dune project in Phase 3. Overall, total-wise, looking at everything in totality, 424,000 cubic yards of sand was measured as a gain, largely due to recent nourishment efforts. Environmental impact statement with the Army Corps of Engineers. Of course, we've had our monthly call with them, held in early August with the mayor and Mayor Pro Tem and myself. Chapter 4 has been received and reviewed by the Army Corps, and Dow Cordy, who is the engineers, have expected to have chapters 5 and 6, which they reported that will be submitted by August 15th. We have another meeting scheduled for August 30th to follow up once again this month and to make sure that we're tracking as far as their schedule goes.
Just a quick question on that. When I was looking at the budgets for shoreline protection, we've got money in there for that, correct? Is it like $280,000?
Yes, correct. Yes, everything that we pay out to Dow Cordy is budgeted.
Okay, so it is budgeted to get the work done there.
Yeah. Damaged crossovers, the contractors completed repairs to damaged crossovers recently in the Porpoise Place and Marina Way area. So those have been replaced and repaired. So once the season ends, we'll be going through and doing another full assessment and working on crossovers during the off-season for any remaining repairs that need to be made. The Phase 4 grant, I submitted an amendment and extension request for a state grant for Phase 4 work. I did those yesterday. If approved, it'll be until December 18th, 2025. We asked for an extension now for the grant to allow for the project completion based on environmental window restrictions, of course, which we're all aware of with turtle season, and also project production rates, which we know are going to be a challenge and issue just with all of the projects that we have slated and on schedule for between Phase 5 and Phase 4. So basically the contractor, like we said, only has 5.5 months out of the year to perform the work. So right now we're anticipating that the non-grant portion is anticipated to be completed by the end of February 2024, with work starting on the grant in March of 2024, continuing till April 30th, 2024, and that is of course when nourishment season ends. So the contractor right now with production rates and what they're communicating to engineers is that we'll still likely need to get a portion up through February, the end of February 2025 of the next nourishment season to get that completed. But it's just all about making sure that we've also put in there a buffer of time for any type of weather delays, mechanical delays. It's just giving us, the town, the buffer for anything that could come our way as far as delay-wise, so that we don't jeopardize any of our grant funding with the $10.5 million. That concludes my report.
Thank you. Any questions about that? It's not quite as hard when you're not in the middle of all the work, is it?
Just one additional comment. I'm actually putting together a sheet kind of looking at kind of where we are with projects and everything else. And I think this committee knows it, but in the budget this year, the shoreline number that's going into the budget out of the total is $4.254 million. That's going into shoreline protection this year. The big numbers are paying down the debt that we've got from the Phase 5 project, which we've paid down a bunch of, and the other one is and I think that goes for us, is putting money away for future projects. Because I think that one of the things we've realized is the Bisac committee is one is interest rates are high, okay, but we need to start putting money away because, as I think we've talked about as a committee, this isn't a one-stop type of thing where you go in, you do one project and we're done. This has got to be a continuous type of thing where we keep putting money into the beach every year, you know, because the town, as much as we like to think that everybody comes here because how wonderful the people are, a lot of it has to do with the beach. So I think that we're trying to build that fund up, make sure we've got money in there for the projects and stuff. And I think that's the focus of the board.
Okay. All right, we're fixing to get into the portion of the meeting that we've all looked forward to, and that's having some more presentation and discussion of our proposed Middle Thompson Beach 5-year action plan and our 30-year plan. Oh. I'm sorry, did I get that on record? I need to do it all over again. I would do it over again. Okay. Now, let's see what I said. We're going to get to the portion of our meeting that we've all been here for, not that we didn't want to listen to Manager Darian, of course, but we're going to have Chris Gibson begin some more conversation about and discussion of the proposed North Thompson Beach 5-year action plan and our 30-year plan for the beach. One thing I want to make sure I tell you now, Chris is we're doing this by WebEx, so we don't have a hard copy of his presentation, and I know that for myself it's going to be very difficult if I'm not looking at something to formulate a lot of the comments and questions that I might have if I'm looking at it. So we will have questions and comments made by it, but we will probably get the hard copies of this before our next meeting, and we will at our September meeting actually have the whole presentation in hand. Is that correct, Chris? And
yes, sir. And I want to apologize on that first off. I put this together, and I spend a lot of time, when I do things, I spend a lot of time thinking about it, and then a relatively brief time writing it all out. That's kind of my style. When I sent in a copy of what I had written out the last few days, and what my comments that kind of came back to me were, I made some assumptions about certain things, particularly going along with what's happening with the EIS that may or may not have been ready for prime time. So I've withheld that temporarily till I can get more information on that, both from Alice and directly from Dow Cordy, so that I don't make any undue assumptions. What I would like to discuss today is a couple things that I think are important, because one of them has been going on a bit of a political thing within the town, and that is, what is the beach management area? I think that needs to be discussed here at the Bisac as we go into this 5 and 30-year plan, and then I'd like to kind of go over what we've got mainly for the 5-year plan, and then because the 30-year plan is very dependent on things that are outside of TI Coastal's control. One thing I would like to say, it was good to hear, because we did the surveys for the beach back in June. We don't do the analysis, we turn that data over to Fran, and so it was good to hear that the accretion for the year was roughly what the nourishment was for the year, which meant overall, without a storm, the beach is relatively stable, and it does not erode without a storm event, which is kind of the way we've looked at this all along. One of the big questions that we've had that's come up and has been debated, I'm sure, both publicly and in closed session, has to do with, where does the management area begin? And I'm talking about from an east-west direction. Obviously, the town is going to manage the beach from one end of town to the other. However, the question is, how do we manage both the beach and the dunes? And I bring that up because the town has had various forms of construction that occur inside the 60-foot or 3 times erosion rate setback that the state has.
Hey, hang on one sec. I need to interrupt something. There was not a discussion in closed session about that. there was a board discussion, because, closed session doesn't deal with stuff like that. I think that was just a slip of the tongue. The planning board has been given direction from the Board of Aldermen as part of the Board of Aldermen meeting, and then an open meeting. I'm looking at one of the planning people who's nodding her head, and that went there. There was no closed session discussion about what we were gonna do, that type of thing. Everything was out in front, everything was before, the board, and then everything went to the planning board, and they are looking at the issue now. Just so we're clear for the record, this wasn't some closed session discussion about what we ought to be doing. It really just came out of, I need to be, and I brought it up at the board meeting, so I know where the discussions were, and I know Mike felt the same way. So just a clarification, that was a Board of Aldermen meeting. It's now in the planning board for them to take a look at, and I think, I'm looking at Susan, they're gonna be meeting again in September and hitting that same issue. That's why I think your comment about where we are in this is very good, because I think they're gonna be looking to you for some guidance on that, and Susan's nodding her head. Correct, Susan? All right, sorry, go ahead.
And I apologize for that misstep on the closed session thing. I'm terribly sorry for that. But one of the things that's very important, and again, one of the things that's come up multiple times has been the issue particularly of swimming pools and that setback. One of the things that needs to be understood is that setback that is there for a purpose. And that purpose is, during storm events, we expect major erosion well beyond what is happening on a regular basis. And that is, by definition, the ocean erodible area with the state. So what happens if we have stuff that is constructed in that area? When we have erosion, those structures can be not only destroyed, but can also become weaponized, shall we say, in that they become movable. I'm trying to find my exact comments here that I wrote. So when you look at the dune, what we really have to look at is from the back of the dune forward. We want to protect the existing dune, build new dune if possible, build the beach which deflects ocean energy and protects the dune, as well as to build the underwater nearshore bar which protects the beach. When we look at the back of the dune, when we start digging into that, it really does weaken the dune, especially in areas where there's already been historical erosion and you have an escarpment on the front. That becomes a very unstable area very quickly. Digging out for construction and then backfilling does not do the same as leaving it alone, because throughout where there's vegetation, typically those roots extend several feet into the ground and protect the surface area and hold it together. Where once you dig it up and then try to place it back, that's no longer there. And any plants that you plant, the root mass starts there and works up as they're buried by sand. If you have a pool or decking that is within 30 feet of the first line of stable vegetation, that would put it almost seaward of the frontal dune crest. And so again, what you're looking at is very little protection for that item. And once that item is loosened, then you may be looking at a channelized erosion area or a dune breach. One thing Oak Island found out several years ago was that swimming pools, fiberglass swimming pools, float and they become projectiles. That is a problem when you're talking about getting into that setback area. There were several pools that were uplifted there during Hurricane Florence. One of them was flipped completely upside down and wound up on top of somebody's gazebo. Again, other structures like gazebos, we've seen large covered structures that are allowed by the state in those areas. For instance, Surf City, one of the gazebos that was destroyed in Florence, stayed on the beach for well over a year and was not only a hazard to folks, but a public nuisance. And then once it was out on the front, it became a debate between the owner and the town as to whose responsibility it was to clean that up. So our recommendations is really that the town has the ability to be more restrictive in what they do than the state. They can't be less restrictive, but they can be more restrictive, and that we really should protect the whole dune system and the 60-foot setback for future erosions. You've got, and you can see it in town, like for instance at the park areas where you have at-grade drive-throughs. The town itself behind the dune is relatively low, and we've seen example after example of what happens when water is able to get through those breach areas. So one of the first recommendations we have on the 5-year, 30-year plan is that we really do try to limit the amount of construction into that ocean erodible area, and to try to protect the whole system as much as possible. We're talking about spending, initially by the time you're done with construction, the town will have spent, whether of their own money or grants, in excess of $60 million to restore the beach to a time frame that was 10 or 15 years ago. Spending that kind of money and then looking forward to what will need to be spent on an annual basis, it just doesn't make sense to not protect that as much as possible. At least from an engineering perspective, again, there are political sides to this, and that goes beyond, that's a thing for an alderman's decision, and not an engineer's. What we're looking at right now, as Alice mentioned before, over the next 2 years, we're looking at completing Reach 5 and Reach 4. And as we'll probably see from the surveys, that without storms, those areas are outside the influence area and are relatively stable and will have minimal erosion long term. We're actually looking at the erosion rate down there. You're looking at somewhere on the order of about 120,000 cubic yards a year in both of those two reaches combined, which is a relatively low amount for six miles of beach. Also, as Alice mentioned, the Surf City project, there's questions of whether we'll get bleed off or whether sand will go to Surf City. Once the Surf City project is built, it will act kind of as a tow-in for Reach 5, which means that because they will actually be wider on the initial construction than what has been done in Reach 5. So you won't see sand migrate as much into Surf City as you will sand move from Surf City up into North Topsail. The sand swishes and swashes back and forth depending on whether the wind's out of the southwest or the northeast. And overall, I think once the Surf City project is built, for the first couple of years, the overall migration rate will be more from south to north than north to south, and then long term will revert back to the north to south direction once the Surf City project erodes back to its equilibrium profile. So for the 5-year, there's really one recommendation that we have as far as for the initial construction for finishing areas 1 through 3. And we have 4 kind of options to look at what to do there, but they are basically all the same option. What that is DA 143 is a easily permittable, relatively, and relative is a word, please put that in perspective, relatively inexpensive way to nourish the areas one time north of the 210 bridge. Now, when I say that's relatively inexpensive, if we were to look at a sand placement in 1 through 3 of the order of magnitude of what we're doing in 4 and 5, that project would be on the order of $24 million gross. That's looking at putting approximately 1.1 million cubic yards along that area, which is roughly about 40 yards per linear foot, which is what we've been doing in 4 and 5. However, because when you mobilize a dredge, it's the mobilization and the laying of pipe is a very expensive part of it. We would estimate that the mobilization cost to get the dredge here, get the pipelines laid, would be on the order of $9 to $10 million. So once you're here, and then it would be a cost of roughly $12.75 a yard at current cost rates to pump that sand and grade it on the beach. In DA 143, there's just over 2 million cubic yards of beach quality material. We did a study for the town circa 2007 where we did, as my former company GBA, we did push cores that were 50 foot long, went down to about elevation minus 20 and looked at the material, and the layer above mean sea level was very good beach quality material that had been dredged out of the intercoastal waterway, while getting below that became material that is very good for oyster growing and stump sale. What we would say is if we're there, if we've got the dredge there and we've spent $9 to $10 million getting the dredge there, it would be our advice to go ahead and dredge the entire site, go ahead and build 100 cubic yards per linear foot, and in doing that, we would be able to put in an additional starter dune in front of what the dunes that are there to start trying to push that whole profile forward. Again, if you look at doing that, we're talking about a cost that is, gross cost that is around $36 million. One of the things that we have been researching as we've gone along is the potential for how to pay for that. That's an astronomical number for a town the size of North Topsail Beach to take on by themselves. So if you look, there are different grant programs, as you've seen with what we've gotten for Reach 4. There are similar programs that would be able to be put toward this at a 1-to-1 match. There is language that is in the current rules bill at the state, which is HB 600, that would allow some shallow draft money to go towards sites like this, because doing this would increase the dredge disposal capacity along the intercoastal waterway. That is a 3-to-1 grant. So realistically, I think that we can look at the cost to the town being somewhere on the order of 6 to 7, at a top end maybe $8 million to do this, which I think to nourish what is approximately 5 miles of beach is a very inexpensive rate to do that. Looking at time frame, we're looking at probably, because of the town's finances bringing money in, that realistically you've got to get through the fronting of money for the FEMA projects and the grant project that's happening in 4 and 5. At the same time, you're putting a couple of $1 million away a year, and somewhere in the probably 2026 would be when is realistic that the town will be probably in a financial position with the additional grants and potentially legislative allotments that you would be able to do this. One of the nice things about dredges compared to dealing with truck haul is the production rate. Production rate on a project like this would be on the order of 20 to 30,000 cubic yards per day, rather than 2 to 3,000 yards per day. So in this case, a 2 million yard project is very feasible in a single season. As an example, down at Topsail, we are currently contracted to do 1.6 million yards of dredging and beach placement this year along 4 miles, and the contractor is expecting to complete in 80 days. So significant difference from what we're looking at on the truck haul scenario. With that, I'd like to open it up to some questions, and then I'll talk about some of the longer term plans. Briefly, let me put one more thing in there that I've talked about before, and I think we should very much consider as we go through this reaches 1 through 3. There is, I've presented you before an idea that potentially the data has shown that the very northern part of Reach 1, that would be Topsail Reefs North, all that sandbag area, that area is highly erodible. The placement of sand there is only, as it stands right now, is more of a short-term solution than a long-term solution, and repeated nourishments would be necessary at a pace much greater than south of the reefs, and that is because of the inlet influence there. And that's the case with all areas that are in inlet influence. If you're talking about the southern end of Figure 8 Island, the southern 3,500 feet of Figure 8 Island is very much like that. If you look at the Ocean Isle or Holden Beach, the ends are very susceptible to inlet situations. Topsail Beach, on the other hand, is not quite as susceptible because of Serenity Point. It is, but it's not, because that's a whole long undeveloped area, so it's not quite as quick to be noticed what's happening there. So what we've talked about doing is trying to permit within the nourishment plan a temporary sheet pile wall that would act in a similar manner as the groin. Because that would hold the nourishment at the northern end of Reach 1 and prevent it from going back into the inlet and waterway immediately, potentially causing a navigation issue. So I think we have enough data, and from the modeling that we've done over the last month and a half, the indications are that that would be a excellent component to shore up that area while any work is moving forward to find out what the best alternative is through the EIS process. Also, if it is done as a construction logistics, I believe that it would qualify for various grants where terminal groin is strictly, at this point in time, an on-your-own thing in the state of North Carolina. So at this point, I'd like to kind of open up some questions on that, if there are any, and then talk about how we would deal with longer-term maintenance, at least our thoughts at this point.
I just have one quick question for you, Chris. You talked about funding and other things that are coming in, right? My question is, would you turn that one off? Yeah. I'm assuming if you look at what happened with the Phase 4 money in the grant, that whatever plan that you've got put together, because you're talking about a dredge, but if there's an opportunistic thing like we did in Phase 4, right, where we get the money up front, then waiting for a dredge to do the whole thing, if we've got, and I'm going to use a bad term, free money, we're going to be able to take advantage of anything that comes along like the Phase 4 project, right?
Oh, absolutely. We do advance that even farther than just grants. As you look, obviously anytime there's an opportunity to have someone else pay for the mobilization, you should always expand on what you're doing when that happens, because that is the biggest bang for your buck. There will be opportunities. We talk about the known grant programs. But prior to the time frame when this would actually probably come to fruition realistically for the town, we have another budget cycle to work through in 2025 with the state. And between now and then, the town should actively work toward getting a legislative allotment. That has happened before for Topsail Island. There was about $5 million that was divvied up among the 3 towns about 5 years ago. That was a non-matching allotment that came. There was legislated for Oak Island in the 2021 budget. They were given a $20 million grant by the state, which is being held till they're ready to move forward with their beach management program, which I think is probably going to happen in the next, not this coming year, but next season. So there are tremendous opportunities there to find dollars that are free dollars as well as matching dollars between now and the time frame we would expect to see this in the winter of 25, 26, or 26, 27.
Chris, could you talk, you brought up the temporary structure on the north end. Could you talk about the mechanics of that? In other words, the approval process. Is that something we just include in our plan and say we're going to do it, or do we have to get approval from somebody? Who starts that ball rolling, and what are the hurdles to getting that done, other than the financial ones? We know that.
Okay, so the hurdles, the way that we would approach this is that when we are permitting the use of DA 143 sand and the beach renourishment project in sections 1 through 3, we would apply this as a construction logistic for stabilization of that beach in that permit. It is not 100% guarantee that would be permissible, that they would, it could potentially be a situation where they say, hey, you're in the EIS process for a terminal groin, you need to work through that process and not do anything ahead. But I believe that this is an opportunity to do something that, if it does cause any kind of negative environmental impacts, the ability to remove it is very easy, and we have an example locally of doing that. When Mason's Inlet was opened, the control of that inlet opening was done by placing a 600-foot long sheet pile wall horizontal to the beach, and then when they were ready to open it, they pulled that sheet pile out, and doing it from either side, they pulled 400 feet in a single tide cycle. And that's one of the advantages I see, and the ability I think that we have from having done that 20 years ago and seeing how well that worked and how well it controlled the scenario, allowed for the inlet to naturalize without making huge shoreline issues on either side. And then when the final wings of that wall were removed, there was an obvious change in the whole surrounding area, and significant erosion on both sides. So there is definitely a documented positive use of this and a documented ability to go backwards if we need to by removing that wall. And the nice part is, if you do that, the materials that you paid for are fully recyclable. And that's not by just in scrap metal. Those sheets are used and reused in various kinds of work throughout the country on a regular basis. So, again, the logistics of it would be putting it through the permit and working through that permit process. It's one of the reasons that I think that it would probably take us 2 years to work through the permitting process for the DA 143 and kind of scheduling that on that timeline, is to have time to do that. Whereas I think just because if you were emptying a disposal site that's an already disturbed area and putting it on the beach, which had permitted activities already, that would be a much quicker process permitting wise, 6 to 9 months. So we're dedicating about a year just to the review of that northern that northern structure to try to help retain as much sand on the beach as possible.
I got a couple questions for you, Chris.
Sure.
The sheet pile would probably be a lot shorter in length than what's proposed for the terminal groin. Is that correct?
It would be, because, you know, my thought process overall that long-term the terminal groin could be something that the town would see advantageous. Looking at this wall, we're talking about starting at the northern sandbags, and it would extend from the sandbags basically out to the stern of that shrimp boat, 750 feet. And that would be enough, if we put that in for roughly 300 feet, it would be up to elevation 5, which would be a beach berm elevation, and then taper down to 0 at the shrimp boat. That would be enough to keep that northern area, keep the sand up on there, and any flow that we have back passing into the inlet would have to go around that structure. And so the inshore, the shored most 150 to 200 feet of the sand would likely be able to stay and be able to maintain. And I say maintain, that does not mean permanently keep. That means get it to a level that is maintainable for beach up southward to the reefs.
Okay, so it sounds like from what you've described as the mobilization costs for the dredge, that the taking of DA 143, we'll call it, needs to be done in a continuous cycle. In other words, that mobilization fee would be paid one time, and all of that 2 million cubic yards would need to come over to the beach, so we don't have a second cycle of mobilization fees. That's my question. And can that be done with, between the end of turtle season and the start of turtle season?
So yes, sir, on both accounts. One, whether you pump 1 cubic yard onto the beach, or whether you pump 2 million cubic yards on the beach, the mobilization cost is the same. So if you pump 1 cubic yard, it's going to be $9,012.75, and if you pump 2 million, it's going to be $35 million. So it is best to do that. There is also future concerns for that area, that in remaking that area into a viable disposal area means that there may be sands that are and material that is not beach quality put into that, and that could potentially hamper the use of the other 1 million yards that we might leave behind. So we need to be very careful to make sure that we get, again, from a cost scenario and from an advantage for the town, our recommendation is it's best to hit it all in one shot, take the whole thing down, and get all the sand you can right off the bat, because that is while it's more expensive in the short term, it's definitely less expensive in the long term, and there's less risk of losing the use of any potential sand left there.
All right, and then kind of one technical question. DA 143 has been there for many, many years, and I can see it out off of my back porch deck. It's got some pretty large pine trees have grown in there. So there is going to be some sort of process that's going to be had to go through to remove that vegetation. And those pine trees, if you know pines, have pretty deep tap roots. So it's going to be, it's just not like you can pull the dredge up there and start dredging, because that vegetation seems to me is going to have to be cleared off some way. So have you thought about that?
Yes, sir, absolutely. And approximately $1 million of the mobilization is in clearing and grubbing of that site. Okay. That is very common. When we did the site DA 189 for Topsail Beach, there were oak trees on that island that were, based on the diameter, probably 65 to 70 years old. That island had not been used except for a small portion that we had used for my neighborhood had not been used in probably at least 70 years. There's no known record of dredging after the initial dredge of the Intercoastal Waterway in that area. Only private sites in the area up there by the boat ramp that's in Pender County now had been dredged after the initial construction of the AIWW. So the point is, in that case, we spent quite a bit on clearing that island of all of the different trees. There were pines. Those are actually, I believe they're not pines, but they're firs of some sort that are on top of that island, if I remember correctly. Because we actually thought about plucking a Christmas tree off of there one time when my kids were young, because that's what they look like to me.
Probably junipers.
Yeah, I think that's correct. Which is a pine. I'm sorry. The point is, clearing and grubbing has been considered. It is considered part of the mobilization cost and a necessary part. As they're dredging, because it's so high, they won't just dig it to the side. They will most likely have dozers pushing sand to them down the hill. So there will be mechanical excavation of that site as part of the dredging process. If they dig into a 20-foot high wall and that wall collapses on the dredge head, what's going to happen is the slurry is going to become too thick and they're going to plug the line. So they have to be very careful about that. And what they did when we did the one at the south end of Topsail Beach, which is DA 205, because it was very similar to 143, was they brought the dredge in, then they would push on the slope with the dozer down to the dredge, let the material fall to it off into the pond, and as they got to a point where it no longer was efficient for the dozer to push to them, they would move forward into the bank with the dredge and then start the process and work their way from one end of the site to the other. The dredging companies are much better at that. While I've seen a lot of projects, they again are the experts, and they will figure out how to do that best for them. And certainly they don't want to get any debris into the pump, because that can clog the pump, and that's downtime, and that's just expensive for them. So they will do a good job of clearing and grubbing before they actually begin sand excavation.
Just one quick comment. I'm trying to understand. Do you know what a cofferdam is?
Yes.
Yeah, when I was working on bridges, is that effectively because those were usable? That's the way we used to do stuff, like bridge building is you basically block the stream. Is that effectively what we're doing you're talking about doing up in the north?
Yeah, it's very much like a cofferdam, a one-sided cofferdam. That's a great way of describing it. And there are walls like this that are permanent structures that turn into permanent structures up and down the coast, particularly while people always worry about looking at the New Jersey coast, because that's where the Corps of Engineers experimented with structures of all sorts of different kinds over the past 75 years. One of the places we worked about 2 years ago was Wildwood, New Jersey, and they were rehabilitating their north end seawall / terminal groin. And in that case, originally what they did was they built a steel sheet pile seawall along the north end of the island, and that worked as a terminal groin to prevent Hereford Inlet from migrating onto them. As the that inlet services a very large bay and has a large tidal range, so the inlet scoured out next to the wall, and over time they placed stone on the seaward side of the wall to prevent that scour, and then over time that rock had to be repaired and added to, because the inlet actually scoured, in that case, because it's services such a large bay, it scoured to about 60 feet deep. So we were up there when they were replacing that rock mattress several years ago. But again, they started with a steel sheet pile wall and then progressed into what we would see as a modern terminal groin. amazingly on that one, they actually have a sidewalk right at the top of it. Buildings are to within, I wouldn't recommend this at North Topsail, but they actually have buildings, a condominium, a set of condominiums that are within 30 to 40 feet of that wall. So it is shown to be a very protective resource.
Chris, I wish we could suck all that knowledge out of your brain and put it in a computer. We'd have it made. For the essence of time, let's move on to the next portion of your presentation in the 30 years, what you're talking about doing, and so we make sure we can get all this conversation had today.
Okay. So looking long term, how do we deal with future maintenance? And that has two distinct possibilities, which have two distinct costs. The short, easy, without anything happening at the north end, which is the most expensive, is looking at using a hopper dredge to get material from offshore. One of the, I would say, so one of the things that's happened in the past with Topsail Beach, oh, come on, computer. As you know, in 2014, there was an offshore bar site used. It was hydraulically dredged to initially build phase Reach 5. That particular site, it was interesting what was done there. The sand, when they did the corings, the sand was relatively clean, but it was a thin veneer. So when they hydraulically dredged it, the cutter head has a series of teeth that dig up the sand, actually flip it on top of the pipeline, and then that sand is sucked into the pipe and distributed. Well, those teeth were chattering on top of the limestone that was right below it, and it was knocking off baseball-sized chips, and those were coming down the pipeline. And then we've all seen what has taken place over the last decade, as far as there's still a handful of those that pop up from time to time. There was a similar situation that occurred down at Oak Island when they used yellow banks, and they have spent 2 decades. There was so much rock that came out of that, and they spent 2 decades trying to clean that up. So what's happened is that offshore source that's immediately offshore of Reach 3 and 4, the agencies have said, no, we're not going back there. Not even with a hopper dredge, that's just not even a possibility. So what's happened at the south end of the island, a borrow area, what's called Borrow Area A, was designated for the use by the Topsail Beach Federal CSDR. There was roughly 50 million cubic yards of sand in there, relatively thick veneer, looking at 6 to 8 feet, which is much more than what we've seen in any of the other ones that were identified off of Surf City or North Topsail Beach. It was the largest of those sites, and because Topsail Beach has decided to use the inlet system as their source of maintenance material, that site has become available for use. So what we would suggest, regardless of what happens for Reaches 4 and 5, because of their distance from the inlet and other renewable resources, would be to use a hopper dredging for Reaches 4 and 5. If nothing is done now let me talk about costs there. Again, hopper dredging is another high mobilization cost. Again, right now they're running about $6 to $7 million to mobilize a hopper. The way they work is they're a self-propelled ship. They suck sand off of the bottom. They trail a pipeline behind the dredge, and they vacuum up the sand. They fill a hopper, which may contain anywhere from 3 to 10,000 yards, and then they motor back up to where they're going to dispose of the material or beach fill, and hook up to a pipeline and pump that material onto the beach as any other dredge would. So you're able to access points and bar areas that may be, the farthest one I've worked with so far has been about 20 miles. This one is about 15 from North Topsail Beach to bar area A. Cost typically for dredging on the hopper dredges and beach placement right now are running somewhere between $15 and $17 a cubic yard. That again is a commodity price because there are a limited number of those vessels in the country. So when it gets busy, it gets busy. Again, it's one of the things that we will need to be opportunistic about in the future. If we see a season that has a lower amount of federal work come out, then we would want to try to jump into that season because the prices would be lower for that kind of dredging than they would be at times when the federal programs are highly active. So at any rate, if we were to do this on strictly with hopper, we would be looking at doing roughly areas 4 and 5 every 6 years, and areas 1 through 3 every 6 years as well. So you'd have a dredging project roughly every 3 years. Again, looking at what would be potential grants and whatnot for that type of dredging, we would be looking on the order on an annualized basis. Locally, you would be needing to put away somewhere on the order of $4 million a year to maintain the beach strictly with a hopper dredge, and that's assuming that there's a 50/50 cost share with the state. The other possibility and would be significantly lower cost. If we do have the ability to use the inlet, intercoastal waterway, and channel to Jacksonville, Cedar Bush Cut, that whole system, with that we could manage areas 1 through 3 effectively with that, and would actually be able to, because of kind of what we've seen and what we've adapted to at Topsail, we would be looking at deepening those channels and widening them somewhat, deepening them down to 16 feet so that we could use a 30-inch dredge and have all the horsepower we need to pump down to the bridge area. By doing that, we would see on about a 4-year interval, we would see about 800,000 cubic yards of sand that we could pull out of the inlet system there, maybe a little bit more, and then place that in 1 through 3. As we went through the interval between, and do that about every 5 years. In between, we would probably see speed bumps that would occur that could present potential navigation issues. Those we would likely handle using the Miss Katie or the dredge Merton, and take that material and actually dispose of it in the nearshore bar down in reach 4 and 5, and that would extend the by doing that, between using 1 and 3 as a feeder source and doing nearshore bar placement, we would probably be able to extend the life of a hopper project in reaches 4 and 5 to once every 10 years. So there are two kind of totally different scenarios, and that has a lot of dependency on what would happen with this temporary steel sheet pile structure, or with what happens down the road with the federal EIS on the north end, to see how those pan out as to which way we would go with that program. Both have their advantages and disadvantages. Both have their they have their cost differential as well. Again, the plan that we would like to see moving forward, if feasible, would reduce the local cost to around $2 to $3 million a year, rather than in excess of 4. So long term, I think if we're able to use the inlet as a bar source, we have the ability to reduce those costs greatly.
If I could just add one, Somebody clicked it off for me real quick.
Go ahead.
Just real quick to remind the committee, current shoreline money that we're putting into the beach fund this year, 4.25 million, all right? Once we've paid off the phase 5, which is, 2 million of the money going there and setting aside, in my opinion, we're not that far off from the money that we're gonna need, particularly because the town now is making sure that money is put aside and that we continue to do these projects going forward. So I don't think we're that far off. And that if he's successful or we're successful in getting other funding in, I think the whole idea behind this, particularly this committee, is to make sure that the resources, that we recognize what resources we're gonna need. And, again, what I like about what he's presenting is, I don't know who brought up the 30-year thing, it's not a one-off. This nourishment has got to keep going and keep going and keep going. And so I think we are taking those steps, and actually represents more than a third of the county's or the town's revenue is going into the beach fund. So just as a heads up.
I just have sorry, can you put that on, please? Thanks. Just a quick question on the cost. I know you talked about the cost of mobilization from 7 to 9 million with a dredge. We know what we're paying right now per cubic yard, or in the $45 per cubic yard range for a truck haul project. Overall, when you look at everything, how does that compare to the dredge option, project-wise?
Oh, great question. So if we're talking about a 2 million yard project out of DA 143, for instance, what we would be looking at is gross cost, including MOB, of about $17.50 a cubic yard. At a million cubic yards, it's roughly $25 a cubic yard. When you're looking at hopper projects in the future, you're looking at somewhere on the order of $28, $29 a cubic yard, gross, counting the mobilization. So it is hopper project, not hopper, truck haul projects are better typically when you have a smaller amount of material or a logistical problem in bringing in a dredge. So like we looked at this originally when we started dealing with, we were not the engineers, but we did advise on it. When you looked at the cost of mobilizing a dredge with what the costs of truck haul were at the time, those have gone up considerably over the last 2 years. But when we were looking at those, and truck haul was on the magnitude of $25 to $30 a yard at the time, and then you looked at when you brought in a dredge and did all of this, we were at $25 to $30 a cubic yard. It was a standoff, and the permitting on one was much easier than the permitting on the other. So that was why the town went that way when we did. Obviously now that number has increased, and so the break point between dredging and truck haul is much lower. It's somewhere down in the 200,000 cubic yard range, where it makes sense to do truck haul, where 18 to 24 months ago it was somewhere closer to 400,000 yards, where the break point was between dredging and truck haul.
Thank you.
Yes, ma'am.
Chris, I have a question for you. The hauling of the sand, would this be sand that you would, excuse me, use for a secondary dune that you were talking about, having the dual dune system, or how would that system play in?
So realistically, if you're talking about truck haul, in the future, unless we have a hot spot that we need to repair, truck haul is not a economically reasonable way of doing things. Again, small scale project, if we've got a dune breach or some sort of very odd divot that's caused into the beach, then maybe we repair that with truck haul because it's cost effective. But otherwise, it would be done with dredging. And so that, the dune that we're talking about putting as a second row in 1 through 3, if we did the whole thing, that would be actually shaped from the dredge material. And in some instances, it's probably going to be better dune material coming out of DA 143 than even the truck haul, because it's a little bit finer, and so it's more susceptible to wind transport, and actually makes it easier for the plants to grow because it's easier for that sand to build up around their root and rhizome system. Did that answer your question?
Yes, thank you.
Are you basically through with that part of your presentation, Chris?
Yes, sir. And again, I will have some ready for prime time documentation for you in the next couple of weeks. Again, I've gotten some comments back on what I sent to Alice the other night, and I will get those ready and take into account more of what's happening with the EIS than I did previously, and make sure that's ready for public consumption.
I just have a question, excuse me.
Go ahead.
It's just a general question. The agenda for the Alderman meeting in September was discussed that you would be doing recommendations for the 5-year and the 30-year
We'll
plan.
kick-
Is
we'll-
that?
we'll have to kick it. That's fine, because I think and Mike can speak for himself, our view is we'd rather get it right at the front end.
Sure.
Okay, and there's some stuff in here about budgeting and all those kind of
Right.
stuff, and I think, Chris is gonna scrub that out more. But I'd rather have it come here. I mean, and again, you can speak for yourself. I'd like it to
Okay.
come to us.
We-
I'd like us to have the document in front of us at least 10 days before our next meeting. We can look at it, respond to it, go back, and if it takes another couple of months, it does. Because remember, we've got all these other projects. It's
Right.
not like we can start a project right now, given everything that's going on.
So that being
But get
said,
it right on the front
not
end.
September.
Yeah, I
That's
don't,
right.
there's no
He's
way.
coming back here in September. That's what my understanding is, that in September, Chris, you're gonna be here with the documentation.
Absolutely, and I really apologize for
Oh, that's fine.
this scenario.
But it'll be right.
I got caught up, and I'm sorry.
Well, things happen, and we want it to be right when we take it to the alderman, so I think the consensus is that we want to do all that here, and then we'll move it forward in October or whatever the
Even if
proper
it takes a
time
couple
frame.
of months here,
Yeah,
it's okay.
yeah, so. All right, has anybody got anything else for Chris?
Well, not for Chris, but just as a follow-on, once we have Chris's documentation, I think it would be good that we ask the town manager provide our Fund 30 expenses, incomes projected out, so we can begin to see, how long it's going to take us to pay off the 2 tranches of the Phase 5 work that we're doing, and when we're going to have enough funds freed up to hopefully match with, we
Chris.
hope the coastal storm damage mitigation fund will still have some money in it in 5 years, but to see what our options are gonna be.
And that's honestly what he's looking at, Mike, is how we match up. Because until we get that, and just, one of the things that people didn't realize, and this goes back to the Army Corps project, when that debt was sitting there on our books, the stuff for Phase 5, there was a side agreement apparently with the LGC that said no beach projects could be done until that was completely paid off. So we wouldn't be talking about doing anything. When we refinanced that and got rid of it and paid it down, and I think we've already made, right, but we've paid 5, 7, 9 million already off on that thing, and we got, what, 3 left, Alice? 3 payments left. Once we get rid of that $2 million a year, that money's gonna go into the beach fund, and now we've got the money going forward. But people didn't realize that 2 things. One is the LGC, which governs our finances, was never going to approve any kind of beach project down there because of the cost. And 2 is we had a restriction, we couldn't do a beach project until we paid it off. And we didn't have $15 million. So we're moving in the right direction, all right, clearly. And I think to Mike's point is, we're gonna see, knock on wood, a cliff drop off in expenditures once that 2 million on the note goes away. That's gonna go back into the beach fund. And you and I have been talking about for years, same with the capital fund, we've got to build up a reserve in this stuff and understand we need to do this every year. So enough of my sermon, but that's where we are.
That's just safe for today. Chris, Chris, we really appreciate you, and I understand we're not pressing you. I know you've had issues and things that's affected some of your timing, and we take that into consideration. So biggest thing we want to do is have it right when we get it, and before we move it forward to the alderman. So thank you, and we look forward to seeing you next month. Thank you, buddy.
I look forward to being there. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, is there any other comments about this before we move to the next item? All right, we're back to public comments. Do we have any now? Yes, please state your name and address, please. Sure.
Susan Meyer, 2224 New River Inlet Road, Unit 138. Couple questions, and I apologize if this has already been answered in your other sessions. One is, how does the COBRA designation mix in with the funding? I know we were able to get Phase 4 funding even though they're COBRA. These funding projects that we're hoping to get to be able to do this other project, that doesn't matter?
Chris will address that after you get.
Okay. Another question is, now I've lost it. Well, I can. Oh, okay. That sounds good.
So to answer your question about COBRA, COBRA only impacts federal funding for initial construction. So in this case, the funding mechanisms we're looking at are state mechanisms, and the state does not recognize a difference between COBRA and non-COBRA zones. So all of the funding we're looking at right now is through that process, and is available. Any future funding through FEMA, we've seen that FEMA grants have been given to the town in the COBRA zones for reconstructive work. A lot of the Category B that was done in the dune restoration of the town was reimbursed by FEMA in the COBRA zone. So it doesn't have as much of an impact as it would on a federal 50-year project.
Did that answer your question?
Yes, thank you. My other question is, this project that you're talking about with the metal sheets and whatnot, the EIS, was my understanding, was that the groin was just one option and that they were looking at other options. Was that one of the other options that we're looking at? Is this in lieu of or in addition to? And if not, will it affect or trigger another EIS?
The EIS has 5 alternatives. The town's preferred alternative was a terminal groin.
Right.
The next alternative is to do nothing,
Right.
Which we're not going there. We're
Not
going
our
to do
favorite.
something.
Right, right.
So there were three other
Other
options.
options.
So, how you build a terminal groin is, an engineering thing. The sheet piling he's talking about, that could be used to make a terminal groin. But in the case we're talking about, it's going to be like Ocean Isle Beach, where they use mats and huge boulders trucked in from the mountains to make the groin. So
Right.
it's different, and it's not part of the EIS.
So this is
Right,
a
and Chris will address
stopgap.
that. Well, no, but I think the other thing we talked about at one of our earlier meetings was the concern we've got is if you wait for the EIS and you don't do anything,
Right.
and then they come back with, well, we don't think you should do anything, we need to have a plan B to deal with it as a town and just say, what are we willing to do, rather than just stand by. So then, Chris, I'd kick it to you, because I think that you addressed a little bit of that before.
So one of the things that we do not want to do with this project, as far as nourishing 1 through 3, is to kick into another EIS process, because that's a long, arduous process. One of the things that we're looking at, one of the main reasons we're looking at DA 143 is because that's a quick, simple solution that's cost effective. So if the agencies came back and said, hey, we want to do this with the sheet pile, and the agencies came back, well, you're going to need an EIS to do that, that would be dropped from our permitting process so that we could deal with the major part of the town, and we would have to look until the outcome of the EIS and look to soft solutions such as the core placing sand from the AIWW at the very northern end to maintain that. We would not allow this to go into the EIS process because it would be bad for the larger route.
Thank you. And my last question is, financially, we're going to be spending money on this. I'm not suggesting that we shouldn't do it or anything like that, but how does that dovetail with the money that we're going to have to come up with for, if in fact we are able to do the growing? And then that's it. Thank you.
And I think I can hit that, and then you can hit it, Mike. I think what we're trying to do right now is, as a town, Chris is going to come up with, this is what you need to do. And I'm assuming it's going to be an all-inclusive of whether it's the sheeting, whether it's the groin, whether it's whatever. What's that cost going to be? And I think what it's going to come down to is, I think our goal is to get it all done. The question is, what can you do financially over time? If we've got X million dollars a year, I think that we'll have to step back from it and figure out what the priorities are, and it may be that we put the sheeting in because that gives us something for X number of years, and then maybe we have to delay 2 and 3 where I live. I don't know, but I think right now he's coming back to us with a big number. We'll get a better feel, as Mike just pointed out, in terms of what we've got. But the good news is we did find 10 point whatever for 4. Okay, we are paying down this loan. All right, and right now we've got over $4 million going into the beach fund per year, because that, and I know it's not the beach thing, but also the capital projects thing we hadn't been putting money away for either. And so right now, if you just look at the town's budget, you've got 65%, 70% of the budget, okay, is going into the beach and capital projects. And that's the funds we've got to build up. We've got to build that money up. We can't borrow at 6, 7, 8% like you're borrowing at now. We've got to put the money aside. And my feeling is, just as one of the aldermen is, the beach needs to be a continuous type of thing. And I think that's what Chris is saying. We need to be doing something continuously on the beach. You can't just wait. So, Mike?
The one thing we can't do is nothing. And I think that's what he was saying. He just took longer to say it.
I always do. I didn't go to law school for nothing.
But for sure, I mean, the terminal growing would be the monument we're trying to get to. The problem is that even if we were to go in and start making applications for permission to do that, I mean, we'd be a long time. And so something's got to happen in that interim time period. And these are the things that are being looked at, and these are the things that Chris is presenting to us, and the alternatives are things that we can do that's going to do what we can do to prevent these erosions and things from happening until we can get to the point of the ultimate of whatever it is we want to do. And what they're talking about with the sleeve, whatnot, I mean, it's something that can work. And we know that Ocean Isle, with what they've done down there, that's worked. I've got a sister that lives down there, and we've been down and looked, and that's made a lot of difference in what's happening there. So there's a number of little things that can happen interim that we can afford, and it can happen more timely than what our ultimate is. So, and that's where we're trying to get to. But he's got to present to us all the things and what our total long-term plan is. And he's not going to just propose, well, what should we do now? He's going to also propose what should be the ultimate that we're heading towards doing over this 30-year period or whatever time frame it be. If that makes sense.
Larry, let me ask Chris a question, because when you said temporary, I think at a previous meeting, temporary is not like 6 months to a year. When you say a steel wall going, didn't you say 50 years?
Okay, so the word temporary, I use that because it's removable.
Correct, that's,
When
that,
you,
right.
and that's the caveat on temporary. The lifespan of a wall like this could be 50 years or more, or if it starts to have negative environmental impacts, then you have the ability to very quickly remove it and stop those environmental impacts.
Right, so temporary means removable,
Temporary-
quickly removable.
Not period.
Yeah.
Quickly removable.
Yep.
When you go out and you put in the underlayment for a stone terminal groin, and then you place those large stones and you place the chink stone in it, your ability to remove that entire structure is virtually zero. Where the ability to remove this kind of structure is quite simple, actually.
Very good, thank you, sir.
This too will be continued. Hopefully next month we'll be here again in September, and we'll have the documentation and things that we can more dig into, and I think that, thank you so much, Chris. Yes. You want-
Before we adjourn, gentleman back there in the gray T-shirt had his hand up earlier.
Oh, I'm
on
sorry.
the manager's report. Do you still have a question, sir?
It pretty well got answered. Alderman Grant had said something about 100 feet. And so it's kind of going, here we are talking in hundreds of, thousands of yards. And then we get into 100.
He thinks small sometimes. Okay.
I'm not voting for you for chairman next time.
Oh, that's good.
Yeah, okay, now change my mind. For chairman.
All right, is there anything else for the good of the committee today? Anybody else got any comments? Then our next meeting is scheduled for Tuesday, September the 19th at 10:30. We'll be documentation about that, and not anything soon. Do I have a motion that we adjourn?
So moved.
So moved. Is there a second? Any objections?